Hello, everyone. It's great to be back here discussing open science. And when we all talk about open science being the norm and not a luxury, a step in this direction was the formulation of the UNESCO recommendations on open science. This member session will familiarize you with these recommendations, their implications, and discuss the next step towards their implementation with governments and the scientific community. The UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science was adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO in November 2021, marking a crucial step towards the advancement of open science. Through this move, member states committed to promoting open science and agreed to report back every 4 years on the progress made. As UNESCO begins its work with members and partners towards implementation of the recommendation, this session is an informal step by the ISC to ensure that the scientific community remains an active and central partner in this process. But before we dive into this, a few housekeeping instructions. I would request all participants to keep their microphones muted while the speaker is presenting. Please feel free to engage in the discussion through the chat box. Lizzie will be dropping some pertinent links there too. You may type your questions on chat so that we could take them up with our speakers towards the end of the session. With that, I now invite our first speaker, Anna Persic, the Chief of the Section of Science Policy and Partnerships at the UNESCO headquarters. She's the perfect person to present the UNESCO recommendation. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Janice, and thank you for the invitation to present to the ISC members a few words about the UNESCO recommendation on open science. Let me just share my screen, and I hope it's going to work. Here we go. Just going to put it in the full screen. I hope you can see it. So just before I start presenting the recommendation itself, I just wanted to say a few words as to why UNESCO was involved in bringing up open science, and also why there was a need to have a normative instrument such as the UNESCO recommendation on open science. What we've seen in the past decades is really that we are dealing with global, very, very complex problems which require innovative solutions. And for those solutions, we do need an efficient, transparent, and vibrant scientific community that also involves not just the scientists, but also the entirety of society. And we also saw that there is kind of a need to democratize science and making the entire scientific process more efficient, equitable, transparent, and inclusive. And particularly in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we really see the need for open science, and that need was accelerated and made even more visible in the past years. Also, what we saw, of course, with the COVID crisis that we are still living in, is how important it is to have a timely and free access to scientific data, publication, and information. How important it is to have scientific collaborations, again, they are dynamic and lively, and that there is a sharing of information at all different levels, between different disciplines, between scientists in different regions, between scientists and other actors, and also this importance of a healthy, I would say, science policy society dialogue. And we've also seen the importance of the human right to share the benefits of scientific progress, as it is enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. So again, we saw the need for open science, and we also saw, at least in the when it comes to the open access to scientific publications, that we can have more access to scientific publications if there is a will at the level of different actors involved in open science ecosystems. So normally we have around 70% of all scientific publications which are locked behind some kind of a paywall. And in the case of COVID-19 related publication, it's exactly the other way around. So some 85% of those publications are actually open access. So we see that the change can happen, and we are wondering, why cannot this change also happen for other important areas of research, and basically for all the research and all science. So in the context of UNESCO, which of course is the United Nations agency that deals with education, science, culture, and communication, even before the COVID crisis, there was a growing recognition of the importance of open science. And the member states acknowledged the fact that there were a lot of different movements of open science happening in different parts of the world and by different actors, but there was no international framework of open science. There was no common definition of what open science is. There was no common set of values, principles, actions. There was no plan ahead, a common for the international community. And that is why the member states asked for the recommendation in 2019. And then for 2 years, the Secretariat of UNESCO, together with numerous partners, including ISC, many of its members and its Secretariat, held this consultative process to gather inputs into the text of the recommendation, which really involved different regions and different stakeholders, different actors, to make sure really that we capture the different perspectives of open science and different challenges that different actors and different countries encounter when implementing open science. So this assistance, support, and promotion of these numerous actors from all around the world in developing the recommendation was very much appreciated. And indeed, in November last year, the member states agreed on a negotiated text and adopted the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which is a legal document, a normative document that the member states have now adopted. And as was said in the opening, they now have to also come back to UNESCO and report back on progress made every 4 years. So just a few words about how open science is defined in the recommendation. It is defined in a very broad and kind of comprehensive way as an ensemble of movements which make scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable, that increase scientific collaboration, sharing of information, and for the benefits of science and society, and that opens the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional science community. We've also defined the different pillars of open science and the various elements of open science, open scientific knowledge that include open access, open research data, open educational resources, open source and software, open hardware, then open science infrastructures, both digital and virtual, open engagement with societal actors through citizen science or voluntary science, crowdsourcing or crowdfunding initiatives, and then also this open dialogue with other knowledge systems, including traditional knowledge holders and indigenous knowledge holders. So a very broad definition of open science that really captures the need for scientists to connect amongst themselves, but also with the rest of the society. As I said, what was very important for the recommendation was to set out the common and shared values and principles for open science, such as quality, integrity, collective benefit, equity and fairness, diversity and inclusiveness. So these are very key values of open science, and every open science practice should really promote those values according to the principles of transparency, scrutiny, equality of opportunity, responsibility, flexibility, sustainability. So it was important for member states to agree on these values and principles so that we know what kind of actions are needed to make open science truly operational and also equitable as it is its aim. There is also a series of actions that are defined in the recommendation, with recommendations for actions for different actors, ranging from basically raising awareness and promoting a common understanding of open science, developing policy, enabling policy environment, investing in human resources, infrastructures and services, promotion of collaboration, and fostering a broad culture of open science. Of course, both the member states and different actors and secretariat realize that there is a lot of challenges in putting in practice open science. And we have, throughout the process of development of the recommendation, gathered some information about what those challenges are. There were synergies across the different regions, and basically they can be regrouped in a way in these 5 areas. So the main challenges include the need to change the conventional scientific culture, human and institutional capacity, which is lacking, adequate infrastructures, including, of course, the reliable internet connectivity. Then the alignment of different incentives, and this includes also really the revision of criteria for evaluation of scientific excellence in scientific careers. It's one of a major challenge for operationalizing open science and the recommendation on open science. And then addressing, of course, some of these unintended negative consequences of open science practices, such as, for example, very high article processing charges or other unintended consequences of open science practice. And we've also identified some key high impact areas that kind of cut across these different challenges and are needed to address those challenges. And those include capacity building, policies, funding, incentives, infrastructures, and monitoring. So for the next phase, meaning the implementation of the recommendation, on the international level, what the Secretariat is planning to do with the help of the different stakeholders and partners, and of course also the ISC and its networks and community, is to first develop a series of supporting tools, technical briefs, fact sheets, guidelines to better explain what exactly is in the recommendation and what it means for the different audiences and for the different countries, to map and collect existing open science policies and strategies in view of kind of learning from each other, collecting and sharing best practices, looking into financing mechanisms, incentives, promoting open science infrastructures and capacity building. And of course, we do need to collectively also come up with an open science monitoring framework, which for the moment is missing, but it is an exercise that has to be done to be able to monitor the implementation of the recommendation, but also to be able to monitor the impacts of open science on the scientific system and also on society more broadly. So we are working with partners, the Global Open Science Partnership, ISC is part of it, and some of its members as well, the Steering Committee for Open Science, and the working groups. Everybody is invited in these open science working groups. The first meetings have already started, but these are open-ended groups, and everybody is welcome to join in the next meetings and also to contribute to the work of these groups. These groups are along those five high impact areas: capacity building, policies, financing and incentives, infrastructures, and monitoring framework. And we really are looking forward to inputs also from the ISC community. So the way to kind of engage in the process of the implementation is with regards to interactions with UNESCO, and the Secretariat is, of course, to join the UNESCO Open Science Partnership, contribute to Global Open Science Call, calls, we have now launched 2 calls, one for best practices and one for scientific papers on policies on open science. Engage in global discussions and just be in touch. And then, of course, at the national level, there are different countries which are now setting up national committees for the implementation of the recommendation. Our recommendation to the countries was to make sure that they really are multi-stakeholder and that they include all the relevant actors for open science in the different countries. So it would be very good to be informed about these processes that are being put in place in different countries to implement the recommendation and join them as much as that is possible. So I'm going to stop here. Hopefully I didn't go too much over my time, and I'll be here to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Anna, for clearly and concisely presenting these very important recommendations and their implementation plan, and of course, giving us hope that change can happen. And now to tell you all more about the importance and benefits of open science and familiarize you with ISC's contribution towards promoting open science, we have Geoffrey Boulton, ISC governing body member, and importantly, the chair of the steering committee for the Future of Scientific Publication project at the International Science Council. The virtual floor is all yours, Geoffrey.
Thank you, Janice, and apologies for my background. My current background is so dull. As I'm a glaciologist, I've transported myself to Magdalena Fjord in Spitsbergen, an old research area of mine. The ISC applauds the way that UNESCO has taken up the challenge of open science, largely through its influence on its national government members. However, unless we, the scientific community, also take up that challenge, then little of value is likely to result. I'm going to talk about the perspective of the ISC on open science and the work we're currently doing in this domain, with its obvious complementarity with UNESCO recommendations and the work that Anna has just summarized. The vision of the Council is of science as a global public good. It's one that is essential in helping us to navigate the complex world we live in. Economists have long argued that knowledge, and science as a special form of knowledge, are the most powerful of public goods. And to an economist, the term public goods has a special meaning, that is, free at the point of use. Can we have next slide, please? The essential value of science as a special form of knowledge and a public good is expressed here. It's a formalized approach to knowledge that is rationally explicable, tested against reality and logic, and the scrutiny of peers, and depending fundamentally on peer scrutiny and wide dissemination of its results. Public goods are the basis of most private goods, and have proven to be amongst the most economically efficient forms of public investment. Public goods are such things as good roads, an honest police force, and public education. And though they may be costly to provide, they're made available for general use at zero price. To a very great degree, therefore, they're primarily funded by governments. Those provisions that I've just mentioned lead to the efficient distribution of goods and services, to fraud-free transactions, and in creating new knowledge-based opportunities through education. Science creates new possibilities, whilst complementary efforts in business, in government, or in wider society by citizens make those possibilities tangible, usable, and socially and economically profitable. Science is at its most efficient, therefore, when the probability of error in its outputs is minimized, though it cannot be absolutely removed, and when those outputs permeate most deeply and widely within society to the greatest diversity of societal actors in realizing novel opportunities for productive use. We, that is the ISC, see open science as potentially the most efficient way of delivering science as a public good. Over the last 2 years, a major part of the ISC's work on open science has focused on scientific publishing, the most problematic barrier to realizing the aspirations of a new era of open science. The ISC Steering Committee on Open Science has adopted a two-phase approach, a first phase of analysis, followed by a second phase of action. Can we have the next slide, please? Our analyses so far have been contained in these 4 reports. The first 2 on problems, particularly business models and the extent to which the current publishing system serves the needs of science, and the second 2 dealing with solutions, particularly for enhancing rigor and enhancing global affordability. Next slide, please. These reports also articulate 8 key principles for open science publishing, as shown on this slide. They were overwhelmingly endorsed by the ISC community during its General Assembly last October. The assessments of our steering group of the extent to which the current dominantly commercial model serves these key principles that reflect the needs of science are shown here. We score them poor in red, weak in orange, and good in green. As you will see, our assessment is very negative. The ones that give us the greatest concern are, number 1, the global apartheid of access between the rich and the poor, detrimental to all of us. Number 2, that much of the record of science is inaccessible because of copyright. Number 4, that a fundamental scientific precept that a published truth claim must, not should be, but must be accompanied by the evidence on which it's based, the data that is, a precept that is largely ignored. And 8, the governance of an increasing part of the record of science is in private hands for private profit, and not in the hands of the scientific community that's best able to ensure proper priorities. As the ISC project moves into its second phase, that of action, we need to determine what actions would be most effective in removing barriers to realization of open access, open science priorities. Can I have the next slide, please? We suggest that there are 4 fundamental areas of potential benefit from an open science regime, and therefore that these 4 key areas should condition our choice of actions. They're firstly, improving the rigor of science by subjecting its processes and products to open scrutiny. Secondly, reforming the current business model of scientific publishing to deliver the priority of a more efficient, globally affordable scientific publishing system. Thirdly, changing the exclusive obsession of scientists with publication in favor of a more diverse model of dissemination and the application of scientific knowledge through reformation of the processes of assessment of scientists and their universities, which at the moment are highly monotonic and focused excessively on bibliometrics. We then have a 4th ambition, an aspirational concern, which some of you might regard as unrealistic, but one should occasionally attempt the unrealistic, and that is to create an effective international scientific community as a reality, which depends on reforming the way that international science is funded, its priorities, and the way it communicates and engages. Next slide, please. This slide and the next show the options for action that we're considering in relation to each of these 4 areas of benefit. I'll mention one possible action for each area. For area 1, we're considering the possibility that we develop a concordat with all publishers to require concurrent data deposition, fair data deposition, in support of contemporary publications. Secondly, that we promote the normalization of preprints and their evolution. Next slide, please. And thirdly, that we seek reformation of the incentives for scientists and their institutions. This is the purpose of a current joint inter-academy partnership, Global Young Academy, International Science Council working group, which it's hoped will liaise with the many other groups working on this issue internationally. And then 4 is this very ambitious perspective. It involves all the issues I've discussed and more beyond. But we're at a time when the global political reality is increased isolation within national and regional silos, which is the last thing that we need when humanity's greatest challenge must be confronted by our collective action to avoid collective destruction of the ecology of human life. This is a challenge that demands unified action as never before, and in such circumstances it's vitally important that the scientific community comes together in mutual respect for our different perspectives and in enhanced collaboration to address the issues that we all face. Next slide, please. In relation to this last ambitious priority, and you can see that both Anna and I have an obsession with gears, this slide attempts to capture the sorts of discussions and debates that are beginning to erupt about how national and international science and innovation systems are or operating or should operate and interrelate in a sort of global science commons underpinned by shared open science principles and process, and with rapid communication at its heart. This is an enormously problematic issue, one of aspiration, but we may be able to make it reality. It matters, and we need the support of all scientists in moving towards this sort of better organized world of science in a global commons. Thanks very much.
We cannot hear you, Janice.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Geoffrey, for aptly justifying science as a global public good and highlighting the vital need to break silos and work in unison towards open science. Well, at the core of the open science movement lies the scientific community and the researchers who are key stakeholders in implementation of the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. Hence, representing the scientific community's perspective, we have Christophe Cudennec, the Secretary General of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences, to deliberate on how they aim to accomplish this milestone. Over to you, Christophe.
Many thanks, Janice, and many thanks to ISC for the invitation. I'm speaking in my capacity of Secretary General of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences, which is part of the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, which is a member of the International Science Council. And so I will try to provide here an example from a member of ISC about what is going on in a particular community on open science, with some precursors in the past, with some actual developments and some eventually ideas for the future. Some of us are aware of the UNESCO recommendation, but not all the scientific community, not all the scientists yet. When we look at the recommendation, recommendations for actions are to member states, first of all, and there is a reporting mechanism, as has been said by Anna at the beginning. But many other stakeholders have a role to play in that paradigm shift. Scientists themselves, in their day-to-day behavior and practices, learn societies as self-organized mechanism of the scientific community, and other players. After the recommendation and what we observed in the final debates of the multilateral meeting which we attended in the ISC delegation, and further discussions after with Geoffrey and Mega Sud from ISC Secretariat, we felt the need to publish an article in a scientific journal, in one of the journals in the journal of one of the members of ISC, in particular the association I'm representing, in order to call attention of the community to that recommendation, to the role that the community has to play in that new reorganization, new ecosystem, and the challenges for the future, and to pull some lessons from the COVID crisis, and also to identify some wider challenges regarding the Anthropocene syndrome, including climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., which may be crises and threats which are less obvious to anybody than COVID and threat to lives, but which remains the key challenges for the humanity and so for open science. So this article has been shaped to convey these messages, has been peer-reviewed and recently accepted, and is soon to be published open access in that journal. We will advertise through all the media of ISC and others. And so, as an example, hydrology is a science where we need open science because it is a science based on observations, which sometimes are made by different stakeholders, by different practitioners, water managers, etc. And it also context-based, which means from one catchment to the other, you have to refine data in order to understand the differences, the particular cases, etc. It is also very transversal with different compartments, different challenges, timescales, and so it means interdisciplinarity and exchanges of data between different compartments of science and of society. It's also a science which is interfacing with climate, with ocean, with glacier, etc. And so we really mean open science on the side of fairness. But we also need open science in the terms of translating hydrological results towards the society in order to help sustainable development, in order to make an impact, as water is critical in the Anthropocene for security in general, and for the SDG number 6 and others through interlinkages in Agenda 2030, and it will remain after Agenda 2030, as not all the targets will be reached at the time. And so open science is also needed on that part of societal dialogue, of science-society dialogue, and global good, global public good, as Geoffrey expressed earlier. So we do not begin from scratch. AHS has just celebrated its 100th anniversary, 100 years anniversary. We have been set up after the First World War with the same values than ISC. And our key mechanism across the last century has been a publication framework with a publishing house, editorial boards made of scientists with strong values. And in particular, we have run the oldest series of publication in the discipline since 1924. And over the last century, we have organized disseminations of these books in paper in key libraries across the world, which was a kind of open access and fairness of knowledge before digitization. And we also have the key journal, on which we work in terms of economic model and accessibility model, open, free for readers, for authors, etc. And we also have been very much active in the mentoring process in terms of quantity and content, quality, and linguistic. And we have recently transformed the Red Book publication series into an open access online journal, proceeding journal, with very low cost, which is in fact 30 euro per page, which is very low compared to what is on the market actually. And we have worked on digitization of all the archives, all the records of this series, so back to 1924, in terms of rescuing, of making them accessible, and now more than 100,000 pages of resources are accessible, which is extremely interesting to go into the epistemology and the history and how the association and self-organized community has been facilitating the development and the progress of science on different frontiers. So if I use the figure from the UNESCO recommendation, here it is an example of how we work on our key mechanism of publication in the scientific publication part of the open scientific knowledge segment of the figure. We also, because hydrology, as I told you, is really needing different kind of data from different stakeholders to reach the scientist who then is able to analyze, to assimilate, to articulate, etc. There is really a challenge of doing that, of bringing the best practices, giving examples, and articulating with what UNESCO is also working in terms of facilitation in the International Hydrological Program, and what WMO is also making in terms of standardization and sharing of data in operational services in the countries. And so we've run a special issue on that together, where we drew a lot of very good examples from across the world about data fairness and services and service to the society. So this is another part of open scientific knowledge, aside publication itself, which is more on how we encourage scientists to progress in the sense of fairness, how we curate what is existing, how we help setting up standards with UN agencies or within the scientific community. As a community, we are many individuals from across the world, and we do not tackle the open science challenge from scratch. We have a footprint in the past. We have set up mechanisms and activities and actions which can be seen as precursors of what now is called open science as described in the recommendation. And we can curate that, we can go into a retrospective of that. And together, and we can identify in the history and the epistemology of the association and the discipline, roots for persistent values and new mechanisms. And for instance, we made our big worldwide assembly 10 days ago, celebrating the anniversary. And we have set up posters in order to help the young ones, the older one, explain what has been done across the history, decade after decade. And we are actually developing an online timeline in order to capitalize that in a permanent way on the web. And this is a curation tool towards all the rescued and digitized volume that we have made available on the website and which I presented earlier, which is needed for people who are not aware or do not have time to make all the retrospective themselves. And when we look at that, and we have discussed that 10 days ago in the community. So in order to identify open science ideas for the future, that's why I'm coming back to that here today as an example. We see how a learned society like us can be agenda setting through the organization of special issues, of volumes and conferences on different topics which are important in the air, etc. And also how we have facilitated corporate progress on frontiers. And for instance, during the Cold War, we have really been instrumental in bridging over the divides, for instance, for mapping Antarctica, which was a neutral field where everybody from different parts of the world could cooperate. We then have worked on prospective exercises in order to project towards the future and to identify scientific challenges. And we have set up agenda setting decades over the last 2 decades. Here are the logos for people who can recognize them in the field. And recently, we have organized online and face-to-face exercise over 1 year in order to identify the key challenges for the discipline around which all the community should gather in order to progressively, in order to progress collectively on key topics, and where young people can recognize their own questions and can identify people who are looking at similar questions to articulate, to compare, to progress collectively. So this has led to the 23 unsolved problems in hydrology agenda, which is very much taking off in the community actually. Also, when you look at the retrospective, we can see that the geographic coverage has been very important, including for big countries which are quasi subcontinental regions, and so very important information on hydrology, climate, agricultural productivity, etc., which is very important regarding actual debates, but also facilitating comparisons, analysis of diversity, etc., which is very important, and sharing data in order to go towards regional and worldwide analysis, which we could see emerging in publications over the last 20, 30 years. So this relates to the open scientific knowledge in itself, and also the fact that we avoid having scholars being marginalized in the movement, and open mechanism to make them to make it as inclusive as possible. When we look at the retrospective, we can see also that we have been very efficient, active in terms of standardization of metrology, technology, assimilation of new technology to progress in quality, etc., etc. And this is a topic which is still very active. We have working groups on that. So for instance, a working group on measurement and observation through new technologies, low-cost technologies on different variables of hydrology, etc., which is in fact referring to the physical and virtual infrastructures. We are not astronomers who needed big and unique infrastructures in a world where everybody can go, but we need infrastructures to facilitate the sharing of information between one catchment to the other on one variable and the other, etc. We have just launched also 10 days ago in that assembly I was referring to what we call the digital water globe, which is a platform, spinning globe, where individual scientists can refer, curate their data set, their study cases, refer to data repositories in order to curate and to draw attention, to find potential cooperation, etc. This is how we think we can set up a virtual platform towards data in order to progress on scientific knowledge. And finally, the last working group we have actually is on citizens and hydrology. So it means citizen science, citizen engagement, citizen awareness, so that they structure themselves then to challenge the states and the governing bodies, which are not always environmentally free or efficient toward the sustainable development goals, etc., etc. So all this range of citizen engagement and relationship between scientists and citizens, which in fact relates to open engagement of societal actors, crowdsourcing, citizen and participatory mechanism, and also scientific volunteering. So as any international learned society, we are a worldwide community of members for free, no registration, and members are scientists, academics, practitioners, brokers, and maybe because water is a universal topic, we have really membership from across the world. All this is self-organized by volunteers on a low budget, which remains a strong value, we believe, because nobody comes here for the money, but for the adding value of the network and the learned society. We do that in partnership with sister association, in particular within IUGG, but also with key programs and agencies of the UN system, UNESCO and WMO and UN Water, the coordination mechanism. So we believe that we have been active over the last 100 years in certain way to precursors of open science, that we are actually active on that, and that we can do more, inventing altogether new ways to play the role that scientific should play in that paradigm shift. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Christophe, for putting open science into perspective with the case of hydrology and sharing IIH's pioneering and commendable work towards achieving open access. With that, we now move on to the next part of this session, where we have question and answers. I see a few questions that are up here. I believe there was one question by Professor Mubashiri. I would request you to please be crisp with your question. Please go directly to the question. You can unmute yourself and switch on your video and read out the question yourself, if that's okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you very much indeed. It's fascinating to witness such an activity by different organizations, ISC, UNESCO, and others. I am actually the collaborator of a UNESCO
Professor Mubashiri, I think
Iran, promoting different activities regionally to have all the
Professor Mubashiri, your voice isn't coming through.
Physically and biotechnology.
You just read the question.
So it was great. My concept, as I mentioned, Iran is under sanction and economic.
I will go ahead and read the question. Yeah. So Professor's question is, what will be the driving force to make, he says, the implementation development of open science globally? What is the driving force to make them applied by all the parties involved? I would request any one of you to please take the question and go ahead.
Shall I have a go?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, I think there are two issues. First of all, if we're to be persuasive to stakeholders, we have to be very careful about how we make the case. There are two parts to the case. The first one is about being clear about purpose, and the second is about to be clear about the processes that will enable that purpose to be addressed. If I had any criticism of the UNESCO recommendations, and I don't have many, I'd say that its definition of purpose is rather broad and non-specific. That's one of the things we've tried to do, to say, well, actually, these are the fundamental things that we're trying to do. And I think that's a crucial first step. If you focus on processes without purpose, then people won't take any notice of you. I think the second part is, who are our stakeholders? Who are the key people that we need to persuade? First of all, it's the funders, the national funders, and of course the foundational funders. Their interest is getting the most science they can for their money and having it most effective. They're really very positive about the potential of open science to deliver their purposes. Universities are more difficult. Universities are judged increasingly by these extraordinary metrics these days, which are statistically incoherent and that commit all the sins that we try to avoid our students committing. And yet we're driven by these frankly ridiculous rankings. And getting a university to shift to a much more open enterprise is, from their perspective, a rather difficult thing. How then do we persuade scientists? As I think someone mentioned, it might have been Christophe. Actually, many of our young scientists don't know anything at all about open science. They don't recognize it. On the other hand, I think they are, particularly young scientists, are deeply persuadable about ethically powerful cases. And there's an ethically powerful case here. And I think certainly we can make that amongst our young ones. There's resistance amongst older scientists like me, I suppose. One of them, for example, in making data open, which is a crucial issue, they don't want to do it. Why not? Well, first of all, because they want to use the data again before anyone else sees it. And secondly, of course, it's hard work making data fair. So one of the key roles of bodies like CODATE, WDS, RDA is to make it simple, so that users who are biologists or literary critics you don't have to learn to be computer scientists. So I think there are a series of key approaches that we need to address to different stakeholders, but it's a doable thing.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I think you rightly pointed out the major challenge with regard to bringing that awareness and the ethical awareness and wanting for the researchers to take up or pursue open science. We have another question by Mark Parsons. Mark, would you be able to unmute and ask the question yourself?
Sure, thank you. This is primarily for Geoffrey, but I think Christophe might have a perspective as well. So I am the joint editor-in-chief of an ISC journal, the Data Science Journal, that has been open access for 20 years. And we've been thinking about doing open peer review, but we've been hesitant because of the concerns that junior scientists may be unwilling to openly critique senior scientists, particularly if it's somebody in their field, directly related to their field, and particularly if they're challenging, what is currently a popular theory, the science advances one funeral at a time problem. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on how to address this, because I think we need a pretty major overhaul of the scholarly publishing system.
I mean, I think that peer review is in a bit of a mess at the moment. And there's one major reason for it, and that is erroneously the public, including journalists, and sad to say many science journalists, believe that peer review is an index of quality. We practicing scientists know that is sometimes true, but often not true. I mean, there are occasions when we say, how in heavens did this rubbish get into a published journal after peer review? And there are one or two distinguished examples of that, which you all know about. And I think one of the difficulties that we suppose that peer review is one thing. Actually, it's not. If you go to the high-energy physicists, the cosmologists, for 20 years now, their view has been the crucial peer review, and quite rightly, the crucial peer review takes place after publication. It's what the community thinks of this through experiment and observation. The formal pre-publication peer review is really a temporary phenomenon. However, if we get some high-energy physics wrong for 5 years because of an erroneous publication, it doesn't matter too much. If someone publishes about a clinical process that could be immediately implemented in the clinic, then having fundamental peer review at that stage is important. So the first point is peer review is a diverse animal, and we must be very clear about developing it in a way which recognizes the diversity it has. I think that the other point, Mark, is that when you introduce something, anything that's a radical change from what has happened before, one thinks beforehand of all sorts of reasons why it could go wrong. And ultimately, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And of course, one gets used to these things. I mean, interestingly, a colleague of mine in the social sciences produced a questionnaire within the Social Sciences College in Edinburgh University, asking this very question. And to their surprise, it was low ranked as an issue amongst young researchers. Now, that's one very specific case. I think we need to understand more about it. So I'd say, first of all, peer review is diverse, and we must make sure it develops efficiently in that direction. Secondly, we must suck it and see. And thirdly, we must understand how it is different sectors of our society will respond to changes.
Thanks, Geoffrey, for pointing out that the most important part of the peer review was largely after the publication process. Christophe, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, in our discipline, there is an example of one journal by EGU, which went fully open review, and definitely the journal increased its own indicators in the first years after that change, and then it culminated, and it remains very good. But there is really a psychological dimension on the side of scientists when they are author, when they are reviewer, when they are reader, etc. And we can see benefit and also obstacles in terms of psychology in all sides. As you said, Mark, some people may not review the same because they know they will be seen and read. But also some authors are not going to that journal but because they are fearing. Some go only because it is most prestigious, etc. It is really a matter of psychology, and I haven't taken all the lessons from that yet myself.
Yeah, thank you. I believe it's all a learning process for all of us. I have one quick question to Anna before we go to the next question, particularly in terms of implementation of the UNESCO recommendation. How do you think the challenges for implementation are very different for the global north and the global south? So how do you think this would play out, particularly when we are, involving stakeholders? How much of it do you think is a challenge when there is diversity with regard to the kind of infrastructure that's available? The kind of challenges are very different. Yeah.
I mean, during the process of the development of the recommendation, we really took time to see into the perspectives from different regions and understand really what the different challenges are. And while of course the global south and the global north are not starting from the same point for many disciplines and in many areas, many of the challenges are actually still the same in the different parts of the world, and still fall into those 5 categories that we have kind of fleshed out during our negotiations and also during our conversations with the developing countries and developed countries as well. I think it's very, very important to see open science as global science and global public good, as Geoffrey was saying before. And any open science initiative, and that is quite nicely also defined in the recommendation, has to be seen as embedded in this perspective where it is to be shared with the rest of the world, it is for the benefits of the rest of the world, etc. So that's an important feature of open science practices. One very important thing that came particularly for these developed countries is the need to invest in science. I think, investment in science, investment in open science, it has to be, of course, part of the same envelope, but there has to be investment in science. And I think this is something, for the first time, I think, in an international framework like this, there really is a recommendation to have at least 1% of the GDP, of national GDP, dedicated to science. So I think there needs to be investment and engagement really at the national level, but also, as we say in the recommendation, this mobilization of collaboration at different levels, including international collaboration for open science practices. Because one of the good things also of open science practices is that you do not necessarily have to rebuild everything from scratch in every single country, in every single university, etc. We're talking about some shared platforms and shared infrastructures, etc., that really needs to be taken into account. And at the level, for example, the African Open Science Platform is trying to figure out and galvanize the African science community around these issues and to understand how at the regional level they can work together more to be able to implement open science more efficiently for the benefits of each and every individual country. So of course, I mean, this gap in science, technology, innovation, it exists. It is even growing wider in some instances, but open science can be a tool to bridge it if it's implemented correctly.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And we now have a question from Karen. Karen, you have 2 questions there. So due to paucity of time, if you could quickly put them up.
Yep. And I'll just, I understand we're short on time. I'll quickly go through them and the panel can pick and choose what they feel like talking about. The first question I had was really about cybersecurity and what's the best way to address that in the framework. I'm thinking that the combination of science infrastructures and societal actors need to be brought together. And I'm wondering about the panel's vision about how that can be done effectively. And then the second question is about how our disciplinary repositories can sort of prioritize their actions to support open science requirements of scientific journals. So, as someone on the panel said recently, that it is a lot of work, both on the side of the researchers and the data repositories. And I'm trying to figure out how to triage that. Like, what would be the most effective first step for a data repository that wants to support open science journals.
Could I have a go at Karen's second question?
Sure, Geoffrey, go ahead.
Yep. Okay. Well, first of all, the open science requirements of scientific journals. There are very few scientific journals that have open science requirements in relation to data particularly. I mean, how many of them require you to contemporaneously deposit your data? Very few. However, they should. It is important. And I think repositories should be pushing with the rest of us to get that adopted as a standard. And this is the point where the repositories themselves are enormously important. I mean, I think what we've learned in the last few years that discipline-specific repositories are very efficient, primarily because the semantics that they use are the semantics of their community. Generic repositories have proved to be much more difficult, simply because semantic interoperability is so complicated, and it might well take us a decade to sort it all out. So I think I'd throw the challenge back to you, Karen, to say that the best thing you could do at the moment is involve yourself with some of the rest of us, and I could certainly put you in touch with a number of groups that are trying to ask the question, what could this process look like where the repositories play an absolutely fundamental role in the process of publishing science? And my argument would be quite simply that the published paper is often just a bit of PR. The real evidence, the real science lies in the data. And, you know, we mustn't forget that.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Anybody would like to take a go at the first question on cybersecurity and framework?
I can just say that, of course, it's an important issue, and indeed these two communities definitely need to come together. In the case of recommendation, it mentions it, but it doesn't go into details of cybersecurity. I feel like it is implied, but it is true that it also has to be unpacked a little bit, and we need to understand this much better as we move along with open science practices, and as we have more and more data really openly available on different platforms.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. We have one last question here from Soledad. I know Anna is in a hurry to leave, but if you could quickly take this up, I will read it out. He's asking on what do you say are the benefits individual academics have when adopting open science practices? If somebody could take a go at that.
Everyone's being silent. Oh, Christophe.
Yeah, Christophe is there.
Yeah, the pleasure of making an intellectual progress and to share with society.
Can I make a rather different point? The purpose of open science is not to serve the career, not primarily to serve the careers of young scientists. It's primarily to do science better and to give it greater value in the wider world. But of course, we want clever young people to want to do science and to want to do research. Therefore, we don't want to make it onerous or painful. The fact that we have a culture change was nicely illustrated by, we need a culture change, was nicely illustrated by Anna. I would say that if we're able to get the changes I think we need, one of them will be to liberate scientists, particularly young ones, from the monotonic demands of satisfying bibliometric indices, which are perverse and inappropriate. We don't just do science in order to publish yet another tedious paper and yet another paper and yet another paper. We do it to communicate with our fellow citizens. We need to do it to collaborate with each other. We need to do it to advise policy. But all these other things, which are a fundamental part of the scientific enterprise, are set in the background by the formal demand for publication, citations, the careers of young people. We've got to stop it. And we must recognize that university rankings and citations, all of that is designed to enhance the profits of publishers. It's got nothing to do with the benefits to science. Sorry.
That was part of pleasure I was referring to.
I think that's such a beautiful, conclusion to our discussion in terms of a very emotional and very thoughtful comments. I think we're running short of time, and we would close the question and answer session for now. Thank you to all our speakers, Anna, Geoffrey, and Christophe, for the very insightful presentations. Special thanks to our organizing team, particularly Megha, Gabriela, and Lizzie. And last but not the least, I'm grateful to each one of you participants for adding value to the session through your interaction. Thank you once again. I hope you all have a great day ahead. Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.